And my name is Timothy Lotus, and today I'm going to defend my research project for this class, which was called Beginning a Tragedy, When Did America Enter the Great Depression? Now, the typical answer, of course, is people say the stock market crash of 1929. It's almost a knee-jerk historical reaction. That's when it started, and that's that. But there's a really good case to make that America really was not in a depression until the 1931 European banking collapse, which started in Central Europe, spread to Western Europe, then came to the United States and hit us particularly hard because we lent so much money to European countries during the First World War and especially to Germany after the First World War, that it brought all our banks down. And that's what really caused most of the pain of the Depression, was that the banks were all closing, and the people, even if people didn't have their money in closed banks, they stopped spending it because they were worried that their bank was going to close and they were going to lose all their money. So there was no money to be lent. There was no job creation. And I argue, of course, that the 1931 is a more accurate starting point. And I say this because there's a lot of statistics that show after 1929 there was a brief recession, but it was nothing that serious. Unemployment didn't go up all that significantly. Wages pretty much stayed still until 1931. There really wasn't anything extraordinary about the recession after the stock crash. And in fact, there was a quick recovery. It definitely was a recovery in early 1930. The stock market actually almost gained back all that it lost in early 1930. And then at the end of 1930, there was a bit of a bank contagion in southern United States, starting with Caldwell and Company in Nashville, and it did affect the Bank of the United States, which was a big loss in New York, and there was also a large bank in Philadelphia that went under. But beyond that, it didn't really affect the whole country. And in 1931, early 1931, there's many sources, primary sources, that show that jobs were being created and the economy was definitely in rebound mode in early 1931, before the European mess started with Austria and then Germany and then Western Europe, Britain leaving the pound, and then by September it was in the United States, and banks started to collapse on a massive scale at that point. But there certainly is a case to be made, and the research I did only reinforced my previous beliefs that 1929 stock crash was overrated and the 1931 European bank collapse is underrated or not talked about enough, because that's really what set everything off and turned what was a normal recession into a terrible depression that lasted a long time. And some of the sources, the later sources I had that gave me a lot of good information that reinforced me, were from 1936, the Hoover administration documented narrative goes very detailed, goes month by month through Hoover's term and all the things that were done and the events that took place. It's a very good book, and they said that in 1931 there was job creation, and in early 1931, and in 1930, and before the European bank collapse, that the unemployment numbers were not as bad as they were during the 1920-21 recession, or even as bad as after the panic of 1907. Though they might not be completely accurate, most statistics show unemployment should have been below 10%, which was the post World War II normal, really, and it didn't go above 10% until after 1931. Another book that reinforced my point was called Banksters, Bosses, and Smart Money. It was about the Toledo bank collapse in 1931. Toledo was the most affected city in the United States. 50% unemployment. Almost all their banks went under, But Toledo was relatively uninfected until 1931, and they show another case of how the stock crash really had very little effect on many places in the United States, including Toledo, which turned out to be the worst hit in the Great Depression. They didn't really take a hit after the stock crash; didn't really affect them at all. There's a very relatively few Americans had money in the stock market. It was an upper class game, and most everyday Americans had nothing to do with it, so they weren't really affected. It just made good headlines, and I make that case in my project. The one question I would like to look into in the future is the bank collapses that took place at the end of 1930, starting with Caldwell and Company and the Bank of the United States. They didn't seem to have too big of an effect on the economy as a whole, or cause any major bank failures across the country. It was very limited in scope, and I'd like to look into what made it limited in scope. Why didn't it turn into a bigger deal? And that's definitely something I'd like to look into when I go to my dissertation, which will be something about 1931. Maybe not so much economic, but a social viewpoint of how the people of the United States didn't really see anything extraordinarily bad happening to the economy until 1931. And I passed the 6 minute limit, so I'm going to go now. Thanks for listening, everybody, and have a great day.